The 21st of February 1965, 3:05 p.m. The Audubon Ballroom, Malcolm X, fell to his knees as the fifth bullet tore through his chest. Blood pooled beneath him on the wooden stage. His breathing stopped. His heart went silent. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, Malcolm X was clinically dead. The five assassins smiled, thinking their work was done. 400 witnesses sat in stunned silence. Even his closest allies began to weep, believing they'd lost their leader forever. But then, something happened that defied every law of medicine, physics, and human understanding. Malcolm X opened his eyes. He placed his palms on the stage and pushed himself to his feet. The bullet wounds were gone. The blood had vanished. His white shirt was pristine, unmarked by violence. Malcolm looked directly at his wood, "Be killers," and spoke 5 words that would echo through eternity. "Allah is not finished with me." What happened next wasn't just survival. It wasn't just a comeback. It was divine intervention on a scale that would transform not just Malcolm's life, but the very fabric of American history. Because Malcolm X hadn't just cheated death. He'd been chosen for something far greater. 3 weeks earlier, Malcolm had experienced the vision that would change everything. He was in Mecca, completing his pilgrimage, when it happened during the pre-dawn prayer. As Malcolm prostrated himself before Allah, the world around him disappeared. Suddenly, he was standing in a vast hall of light, surrounded by figures he somehow knew were prophets and messengers who had come before him. A voice spoke, not heard but felt in every cell of his being. "Malcolm Little, L. Haj Malik L. Shabazz, your time of testing approaches." Malcolm tried to speak but found himself silent, overwhelmed by a presence more powerful than anything he'd ever imagined. "You will face death and you will conquer it. Not through your strength, but through mine. What they mean for destruction, I will turn to justice. What they plan for ending, I will make beginning." The vision continued, showing Malcolm scenes of his future, the assassination attempt, his miraculous survival, and something else, a divine retribution that would sweep through his enemies like a plague of justice. "Your revenge will not be your own, it will be mine, and it will be perfect." When Malcolm emerged from the vision, tears streamed down his face. He understood now why he'd been drawn to make the pilgrimage. He'd been called to Mecca not just for spiritual cleansing, but for divine commission. The 19th of February, 1965, Malcolm returned to New York knowing exactly what awaited him. But instead of fear, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He was no longer fighting this battle alone. The creator of the universe had chosen him as an instrument of divine justice. Malcolm called his wife Betty and spoke with a serenity that surprised her. "Betty, I want you to know that whatever happens in the next few days, it is all part of a plan. A plan bigger than anything we can understand." "Malcolm, what are you talking about?" "I am talking about faith, baby. Real faith. The kind that moves mountains and stops bullets." That evening, Malcolm spent hours in prayer, not asking for protection, but asking for the strength to fulfill his divine purpose. The 21st of February, 1965, Malcolm entered the Audubon Ballroom knowing he would die, and knowing he would live again. As he took the stage, Malcolm felt a presence beside him, invisible to everyone else but more real than anything in the physical world. As Salam Alaikum, brothers and sisters, Malcolm began. "Today I want to talk to you about resurrection. Not the kind we read about in books, but the kind we're about to witness. The 5 assassins, Norman 3X Butler, Thomas Hagen, and 3 others, tensed. This wasn't the speech they'd expected. There comes a time in every person's life when they must choose between serving man or serving the Almighty. Today, I make my choice clear." Malcolm raised his hands toward heaven. "I place my life, my death, and my future in the hands of Allah. Whatever happens here today is His will, and His will cannot be defeated by bullets or hatred or fear." That is when Norman Butler stood up and shouted the planned distraction. "Get your hands out of my pockets." Chaos erupted. The 5 shooters drew their weapons and opened fire. But as the bullets flew toward Malcolm, something impossible happened. Time seemed to slow. Malcolm could see each bullet suspended in the air, moving toward him like drops of rain. And in that moment of supernatural clarity, he heard the same divine voice from his vision. "Be still. I am with you." The first bullet struck Malcolm's chest. Then the second, the third, fourth, fifth. Malcolm felt each impact, felt his life force leaving his body, felt his heart stop beating. But instead of falling into darkness, he found himself ascending into light. He was back in the hall of divine presence, standing before the same overwhelming power that had called him in Mecca. "Your death is complete," the voice said. "Now choose. You can rest here in eternal peace, or you can return to finish the work I have given you." Malcolm looked back toward Earth, toward the Audubon ballroom where his body lay lifeless, toward the enemies who thought they'd won, toward the injustice that still needed to be corrected. "Send me back," Malcolm said, without hesitation. "I have work to do. Then you will return not as Malcolm Little, not as Malcolm X, but as my instrument. You will carry my power, my protection, my perfect justice. Are you prepared for what that means?" Malcolm knelt in that hall of light. "I am your servant. Use me as you will." 4 minutes and 17 seconds after his heart stopped, Malcolm X returned to life. But he didn't return alone. As Malcolm stood on that stage, his body healed and whole. A divine authority radiated from him that everyone in the room could feel. The 400 witnesses later described the same sensation. A presence in that ballroom that was beyond human, beyond earthly, beyond anything they'd ever experienced. Malcolm looked at the 5 assassins who stood frozen in terror, and when he spoke, his voice carried the power of absolute justice. "You have shed innocent blood in the name of hatred. Now face the consequences of opposing the Almighty." What happened next would be remembered as the most supernatural event in modern American history. Norman Butler, the first shooter, suddenly cried out and collapsed. Not from any physical attack, but as if struck down by an invisible hand. He began confessing every crime he'd ever committed, weeping uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness. Thomas Hagen fell to his knees, overwhelmed by a crushing sense of guilt that seemed to emanate from Malcolm himself. "I am sorry," he sobbed. "God forgive me, I am sorry." One by one, all 5 assassins were overcome by what witnesses described as a supernatural conviction. They threw down their weapons and confessed not just to the attempted assassination, but to every violent act they'd ever committed. But Malcolm's divine retribution was just beginning. As word of the miracle spread beyond the Audubon ballroom, a wave of supernatural justice began sweeping through everyone connected to the conspiracy against Malcolm. Elijah Muhammad, sitting in his Chicago mansion when news of Malcolm's resurrection reached him, suffered what his doctors called an inexplicable collapse. He began speaking in tongues, confessing to financial crimes, sexual improprieties, and the ordering of multiple murders. The man who'd claimed to be a messenger of God was exposed as a fraud by what seemed to be divine intervention. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was in a Washington meeting when he suddenly doubled over in agony. For the next 3 hours, he experienced what he later described as seeing every evil thing I've ever done played out before my eyes. He resigned from his position the next day and spent his remaining years trying to make amends for decades of illegal surveillance and persecution. Across the country, every police officer who'd harassed civil rights workers, every judge who'd perverted justice, every politician who'd enabled oppression, all began experiencing what religious scholars called divine conviction. Some collapsed in courtrooms, others confessed crimes spontaneously on television. Many simply disappeared, unable to face the overwhelming sense of judgment that seemed to follow them wherever they went. But the most miraculous aspect of Malcolm's divine revenge wasn't the punishment of his enemies. It was the transformation of his mission. After his resurrection, Malcolm found himself possessed of supernatural wisdom and insight. His speeches became prophetic, predicting social changes with impossible accuracy. His presence in a room could bring about instant conversions, with hardened criminals renouncing violence and dedicating their lives to justice. The footage of Malcolm's death and resurrection broadcast on live television became the most watched moment in broadcast history. Religious leaders of every faith declared it a genuine miracle. Scientists struggled to explain how a man could return from clinical death with no medical intervention. But perhaps most importantly, Malcolm's supernatural survival accomplished what decades of activism had failed to achieve. It created undeniable proof that the civil rights movement was blessed by divine favor. Within weeks, racist organizations began collapsing as their members experienced supernatural conviction. Politicians who'd opposed civil rights legislation found themselves compelled to not just support it, but champion it with religious fervor. The same divine power that had resurrected Malcolm seemed to spread through the entire movement, transforming hearts and minds in ways that human persuasion never could. Martin Luther King Jr., who'd had theological differences with Malcolm, publicly declared that he'd witnessed the hand of the Almighty moving in our struggle for justice. 6 months after the resurrection, the most comprehensive civil rights legislation in American history passed Congress with unprecedented support. Racist laws were struck down not through legal challenges, but through divine intervention that made their enforcement impossible. Malcolm X lived another 23 years after his miracle, serving as what he called an instrument of divine justice. His mere presence in a city could bring about social transformation. His prayers for the oppressed were answered with supernatural provision and protection. When he finally died peacefully in 1988, at the age of 62, Malcolm's funeral was attended by millions. People of every race and faith came to honor a man who had literally conquered death in service of justice. But even in death, Malcolm's divine mission continued. The foundation he'd established continued to experience supernatural provision. The causes he'd championed advanced with miraculous momentum. The enemies of justice continued to face divine retribution for generations. The 21st of February 1965 became known as Resurrection Day, a moment when the divine broke through into human history to demonstrate that justice, truth, and righteousness cannot be destroyed by human hatred. Malcolm X had survived execution by miracle. His revenge was divine, and through him, the Almighty had shown that those who fight for justice never fight alone. The bullets meant to silence him had instead announced the arrival of something far more powerful than any human leader, the direct intervention of divine justice in the affairs of men. Malcolm Little had died. Malcolm X had died. But what rose from that stage was something eternal. A living reminder that God sees all, judges all, and ultimately ensures that justice prevails. The miracle wasn't just that Malcolm survived. The miracle was that through his survival, heaven and earth had aligned to create a new world where righteousness would reign. And that world, built on the foundation of divine intervention, would never be the same.